Hey everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1-month vacation from capitalism. I have no idea what day it is, but I know we're in the middle of our program and we've got about 15 more events coming up in the future. I want to clue you into some of them, which of course you can find on our website, www.redmayseattle.org. I will mention a few anyway. Tonight at 6 p.m., How to Weaponize or Defuse a Constitution, with Aziz Rana, Camila Vergara, Richard Kreitner. I'll be moderating. Aziz and Camila have just finished two books, excellent books, on the question of constitution, and it's logical that it should happen both by a Chilean and an American who are writing them, because we're in the midst of a huge constitutional deadlock as we realize how undemocratic our own constitution is. And Chile is about to rewrite it and has elected, thrown out from the Constitutional Convention, all centrists and right politicians. So it has a chance to be a really good one. And we're very excited to follow the progress of that. Tomorrow morning tomorrow mid-afternoon at 3 p.m. Pacific time, Lux, a socialist feminist women's magazine, is doing an event called Starting a Socialist Feminist Women's Magazine. And that will be, panelists will be Sarah Leonard, Marion Jones, Tammy Kim, Cheryl Rivera, and Sharanya Durvasula. At 6 p.m. on Friday night, tomorrow, Theorizing the Present, the Revolutionary Foresight of Black Communist Women. And that will have Charisse Burden-Stelly, Jody Dean, and Ashley Farmer as moderator. On Saturday morning at 11 a.m., the Spectre Journal presents a special panel on the Paris Commune 150 years on, with Stathis Kouvelakis, Carolyn Eichner, and Zachary Levinson as the moderator. At 3 p.m., Paul North and Paul Ryder, who are doing a new English translation of Capital. We'll talk about that. Ever Osorio Ruiz is the narrator. And at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning, We Still Want Everything on I think it's the 50th anniversary of Nanni Ballestrini's book. We have Maria Teresa Carboni, Rachel Kushner, Franco Bifo Berardi, and Jasper Burns as the moderator. And at 2 p.m. on Sunday, another Spectre panel, Class Struggle and Racial Justice After the Union Drive at Amazon in Alabama. That's at 2 p.m. And at 5 p.m., Value, Capitalism, and Communism with Jasper Burns, Cordelia Belton, and Kailash Srinivasan. So 3 panels on Sunday before we take a short break of 2 days to gear up for our last week. So a lot of good stuff coming up. And we are able to put on a program with 43 events and 110 speakers, not out of pure volunteer power, but with no institutional funding. So to keep doing the event, and particularly to go back live again next year, we need your generous assistance and donations. You can do that if you look down at the description of this event in YouTube. There's a link to our GoFundMe, I believe, and there's also one to our website. There's a donate section. You can do either a GoFundMe or become a patron through Patreon at a $3, $5, and $20 level, $20 a month level. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the members of this panel on Marx producing subjects. It's a conversation between Sandro Mezzadra and Jason Reed. Sandro teaches political theory at the University of Bologna. His work centers on the relations between globalization, migration, and political processes, contemporary capitalism. As he's an active participant in the post-workerist debates and one of the founders of the website Urano Made, and he's the author of books like The Politics of Operations, Border as Method, and this one in the Marxian workshops, producing subjects. Those are at any rate the 3 books that are in English. Jason teaches philosophy at Jason Reed at the University of Southern Maine. He's the author of The Micropolitics of Capital and The Politics of Trans-Individuality. Jason, you're also working on a new book for Verso on work, right? Do you have a title for that one yet? Whoops, I think you're muted. Do you have a title on the work panel?
The Double Shift, The Politics and Ideology of Work.
The Double Shift, I like that. So I will turn it over to, are you talking first, Jason, or, whoops, I got you muted again.
Sandro, I thought was going to go first.
Okay, Sandro. All right, Sandro.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Let me say that I am particularly happy to be again at Red May, Seattle. And I am delighted to be in dialogue today with Jason. Indeed, our works share a kind of theoretical and political complicity. I remember the first time I was in the US in 2003. Jason's book, The Micropolitics of Capital, came out, and I was really impressed by the book. In the 1990s, under the pressure of my participation in struggles, movements of migration in Italy and in Europe, I had started to rethink the Foucauldian problematic of the production of subjectivity from the angle of the tension between subjection and subjectivation. In Jason's book, I found a very similar take on the question of subjectivity in Marx. Jason emphasizes in the book the 2 senses of the genitive production of subjectivity under capitalism in Marx. And of course, it takes this image of the 2 senses of the genitive from a scholar, a friend that is important for both of us, I would say, which means Etienne Balibar. What struck me in the Micropolitics of Capital was also the kind of combination between workerism and Althusserianism. I was trained in the tradition of Italian workerism, operaismo, and particularly in the early 1980s, workerism and Althusserianism seem to us to be quite different and far strands of Marxism. Jason's take on the relation between workerism and Althusserianism opened what seemed to me a new field of research precisely on the multiple forms taken by the production of subjectivity under capitalism. So I will just flesh out in this first statement a couple of points that I think are particularly relevant today for thinking about subjectivity in Marx. And the first is the meaning of taking the production of subjectivity as a key to reading Marx today. This distinguishes, I would say, our work on Marx from other interpretations of Marx's work, for instance, from the so-called new Marx reading, Neue Marx Lektüre. For me, it is very important to take subjectivity as a kind of conceptual thread for reading or rereading Marx today in front of contemporary capitalism, in front of a capitalism that, of course, has dramatically changed with respect to Marx's age. Shortly put, capitalism today does not take a specific subjective figure as a target of its exploitative operations, say the industrial worker. It continually redraws boundaries between production and reproduction, production and circulation, labor and life, and so on. And capitalism today exploits, as Jason has recently written, the generic capacities of the human species, or the totality of mental and physical capabilities contained in proletarian bodies, to refer to the Marxian definition of labor power, and indeed kind of rereading of labor power from the angle of the production of subjectivity is very important for my own work on Marx. So the generic capacities of the human species, the totality of mental and physical capabilities contained in proletarian bodies as main target of exploitation today. But these generic capacities and capabilities take on very heterogeneous forms from the angle of subjectivity. Another point that I find particularly important, and again, it is a point on which both Jason and I have written in recent years, is the notion of abstract labor. Again, I will put it quickly. Abstract labor appears to me today as a kind of capitalist framework and standard, as a capitalist norm for subjectivity, for the production of subjectivity. From this point of view, living labor appears as a site of resistance. But the main point is not to reject abstract labor, but rather to think about the reappropriation of the abstract power of abstract labor. In a book that I have recently written with Brett Nilsson, The Politics of Operations, we formulate this problematic in terms of a gap between social cooperation and living labor. So the appropriation of social cooperation by living labor is today, I think, although at an abstract level, the most crucial political task, and requires political processes of subjectivation to break free from capital's command and to appropriate the power of cooperation beyond what Marx called the fetters of individuality and developing the capabilities of the species again. A third and last point to start the conversation regards the most important name of the revolutionary subject in Marx, which means class. In Marx, we find the notion of the working class characterized by absolute homogeneity and by processes of equalization. This is true for the manifesto, but also and above all for the analysis of large-scale industry in Capital, chapter 15. I think that it is crucially important to stress that a history of struggles, first of all around sex and race, has challenged and disrupted such image of the working class. So for me, the anachronistic move to take production of subjectivity as the guiding thread for reading Marx today aims precisely at opening a space in which posthumous dialogues between Marx and that history of struggles become possible. There are, of course, many contributions to critical debates over the last couple of decades that are important from this point of view. I think, for instance, of what Etienne Balibar again wrote about the relations and the tensions in Marx between the working class and the proletariat. Anyway, as far as I am concerned, I am very interested today, and this has a lot to do with the production of subjectivity, of course, in thinking through the relation between class and difference. And I take difference not only as an element of division and fragmentation, but also as a terrain of struggle where new languages of liberation and new criteria for the critique of capitalism emerge. So from this point of view, I see my work as a kind of contribution to the ongoing discussion about the relation between multitude and class in workerism, and in particular in the work of Michael Hart and Tony Negri. I stop here for now.
Thank you, Sandro. Jason?
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to Red May. And I'm very, as Sandro said, I'm very happy to be here to sort of have for the first time in a kind of virtual presence, a kind of dialogue that's been going on sort of silently for a while, ever since I started reading Sandro's work. And I'm also just happy to continue what I consider to be a kind of ideal of a certain kind of research in solidarity, where we endeavor to kind of build off of each other's points and develop a perspective, rather than engage in the sort of asocial sociability of academic work, where everyone is encouraged to kind of antagonistically engage with anyone who might possibly differ from them. So I wanted to talk, and I'm taking this opportunity to talk about this notion of the production of subjectivity. And I want to talk about, I want to trace out some of the ways in which I have been thinking about this and have continued to return to this thesis, and developed it in some ways that I think are going to be quite parallel and conversant with some of the things that Sandro was saying about abstract and concrete labor. So as we discussed, I mean, the first sort of formulation, or the formulation that I was stuck on a while ago, it seems like a long time ago now, is thinking of the production of subjectivity in what I referred to as both senses of the genitive, in terms of capital's production of subjectivity, thinking, of course, of, say, those lines in Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation, where he discusses the need for capital to create a working class which treats its rules as self-evident natural laws, the idea that for capital to exist, it must exist at the level of economic relations, in terms of a proletariat who have nothing to sell but their labor power. It must exist at the level of legal and political relations to guarantee and protect that kind of property and the accumulation of property, but it also must exist at the level of subjectivity. It must produce a kind of subjectivity. Subjectivity produces value. Subjectivity is what is put to work in capital. And following up on a remark by Antonio Negri, where he says at one point that subjectivity is produced in capital in antagonistic ways, I want to think a little bit about some of the points of division, antagonism, and contradiction within the production of subjectivity. The first, and this is something I talked a lot about in my book on transindividuality, is in some sense the difference between the production of subjectivity in what Marx refers to as the sphere of exchange. This is where Marx makes those remarks about how in the sphere of exchange, it is a veritable Eden of the natural rights of freedom, equality, and individuals as autonomous, as free, separate from each other, and to some role as exchangers of our own labor power, which is often undergone in terms of isolation and separation from each other. That production of subjectivity is juxtaposed to the production of subjectivity within the hidden abode of production, as Marx writes, where subjectivity is, or what is put to work, is the necessarily collective powers of what Marx refers to as species being. And I don't mean to say that, I don't mean to juxtapose those two points of view, is to say the isolated individual of exchange and the sort of collective subject of production is anything like a collective subject in a sort of communist sense. The collective subject that capital produces is a collective subject produced for capital, in which workers are disappropriated of both the means of production and the knowledge and know-how of production, and are reduced to parts of a kind of machine. So to follow up on that, I want to talk about another point of contradiction, and that is the division between abstract and concrete labor. As Sandro writes, and this is in the Marxian workshops, and I was rereading this and struck by my exact and total agreement and total attempt to think through this same formulation. Sandro writes, referring to the dual nature of production, which of course Marx attached a great deal of importance to, right? That he said that he had not discovered the role of labor in terms of value, but no one had quite formulated its dual nature as concrete and abstract. And as Sandro writes, as in any other commodity, labor power displays a dual character, but its absolute peculiarity lies in the fact that this dual character is deeply rooted in life, in the body of each individual, and the social fabric they are a part of. So concrete labor, the labor of doing a specific thing, entails its own specific production of subjectivity. And that production of subjectivity, I think, has to be seen as having a dual side. On the one hand, and of course, this varies from instance to instance, and in the historical transformation of capital, the concrete labor, the labor of a specific task or discipline, can have a side which produces subjectivity as a kind of ideal or model of identification, where one identifies with and is recognized by one's specific skills and abilities in the labor process. Concrete labor also has an alienating aspect, in the sense in which one is reduced in one's concrete labor to only a particular manifestation of skills, talents, abilities that human beings possess, and one is reduced to being just whatever one's job might be. And in a similar way, we could argue that abstract labor, the other side, of course, there is no concrete labor without abstract labor, no abstract labor without concrete labor, that abstract labor has a two sides to it as well. It has a side in which, as Sandro mentioned, there's a side in which, you especially see this in texts like the Communist Manifesto, where Marx really celebrates the indifference of abstract labor to the peculiarities and particularities of gender, age, etc., in which there's this ideal of a sort of capitalist indifference to all the differences that have defined human beings. But there's also, at other points, and equally true, I think, of abstract labor, say, for example, in some passages in the Grundrisse, where Marx writes about abstract labor and this almost impossible demand of abstract labor to be a subject of work that is indifferent to specific limitations of the human body, of human subjectivity, to sort of embody the abstract productivity of capital. So I would say that there is, to some extent, even there, we can divide it once again and argue that this ideal of a subjectivity conforming to abstract labor has itself almost an internal division of different sectors of the working class. For some, the ideal of abstract labor is this ideal of total productivity, total flexibility, to be able to work from anywhere, across any screen. For others, the ideal of abstract labor imposes itself as an almost normative, moralizing demand, which we see in contemporary sort of right politics, in which the ideal of work is not so much one of flexibility, but one of discipline. One of the idea that people should willingly subject themselves to any work that is available. And so these divisions, just to kind of wrap up here a little bit, I would say that the production of subjectivity is, as I see it, still split between the double senses of the genitive. The subjectivity is produced and productive, but it also traverses these different divisions between consumption and production, both of which have their own production of subjectivity, and between the production of subjectivity aligned with concrete labor and aligned with abstract labor. And I think this is the extent to which, as Sandro has written in his works with Brett Nielsen, in terms of to think abstract labor as, part of the imposition of total aggregate capital, to think of it as a category, not that annuls differences, but a category from which differences emerge, and these differences are as important as the similarity. And it's from that, I think, that we can articulate some of these challenges to think class globally, and to think class beyond the image of a particular kind of proletariat, which was always, it seems, in some sense, based on identifying abstract labor with a particular kind of concrete labor. Yeah, so that's I guess what I wanted to say to sort of start us out here.
Maybe the best format would be to have Sandro respond to what Jason said, and then Jason respond to what Sandro said, and then at a certain point when you feel you're ready for questions, you can announce it, and I will come in and help you with that.
Thank you, Jason. Just some reflections on 2 points you touched upon. The first one has to do with the question of abstract labor, and more generally with the roles of abstractions, real abstractions, to put it with Jean Rettel, in the working of capitalism. It seems to me that we are opening a kind of original view on abstract labor, which is, of course, a vexed question in the history of Marxism. We both emphasize that there is a moment of domination inherent to the working of abstract labor. But at the same time, we do not think that critique must target primarily abstraction as such. Even abstract labor appears to us as characterized by kind of duplicity. On the one hand, there is this moment of domination or imposition, as you were saying. On the other hand, abstraction embodies, in a way, paradoxically, a collective power that is, in a way, expropriated and appropriated by capital. So the main point is to turn abstraction into a field of struggle, and to imagine the ways in which abstraction, the power of abstraction, can be reappropriated within specific struggles by specific movements. as you know, I have been working quite a lot over the last years, particularly with Brett on logistics and in critical debates on logistics, but also in social movements related to logistics. There is a notion that is circulating quite a lot, and this is the notion of counter logistics. And I think that in a way, the notion of counter logistics points precisely to the need to imagine ways in which the power of abstraction can be appropriated, reappropriated by the exploited. The second and last point has to do with the central Marxian notion of labor power. It is, of course, important to stress the double character of labor power as a commodity. But I think we should go a bit deeper into the discussion of the relation between labor power and production of subjectivity. And this is particularly the case if we take seriously what both of us and many other scholars and activists have written over the last years about primitive accumulation, about so-called primitive accumulation. As we know, one of the main points at stake in Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation is precisely the production of labor power as a commodity. Marx writes that labor power does not exist in nature, that it is the outcome of a long historical process of a world history. In the sections of, in the chapters of Capital on primitive accumulation, he investigates this world historical process of production of labor power as a commodity. It is a world historical process, even though, as we know, Marx's analysis basically focuses on the English instance, with amazing openings when he speaks about slavery, colonialism, etc. So, to put it quickly, I would say that today, this question of the production of labor power as a commodity is again completely open in contemporary capitalism at the global level. We cannot take for granted the existence of labor power as a commodity, which means that all the processes and procedures that Marx describes in his analysis of primitive accumulation are again, in a way, part of our contemporary experience. There are two aspects that I think it is very important to emphasize in this respect, particularly because they are related to the question of class, as you were raising it at the end of your statement. The first is the well-known question of the reproduction of labor power. of production and reproduction of labor power. This is a question that has been worked upon by many feminist scholars and activists, as we know. And it is very important. It is very important because it sheds light on the kind of elusive relation between production and reproduction that today, I think, is a quite important feature of capitalism. The second question is the body, is the politics of the body. We know that Marx has this provoking definition of labor power as the totality of mental and physical capabilities contained in a body. We also know that Marx was kind of convinced that the body was a neutral container. He did not really pay attention to the body. And today, particularly due to a long history of struggles, we know that the body is not at all neutral. We know that the fabrication of the body, in which such elements as sex and race play crucial roles, is a very important aspect of the production of labor power that has important implications for the composition of living labor, for the composition of class, to put it with the workerist language. So it is precisely from this point of view that I try to think about the relation between class and difference. I would have more to say on the point, but I stop here.
Okay, yeah.
You want to respond to Sandro's intervention?
Yes, I think the one thing came up towards the end, which I think is very important, is your point about not taking the reproduction of labor power as a given. And I think that this to me, and I think this is for you too, this is part of the importance of reading Marx on primitive accumulation, that one has to recognize that because there is, one way to read Marx is in a very sort of historicist way around primitive accumulation, that primitive accumulation was necessary prior to the sort of consolidation of capital. But once you eliminate the commons, once you deprive people of any way to reproduce their existence other than selling their labor power, then you can assume the reproduction of labor power as given. And I think that as you were saying, and as I stressed too, that it can never be assumed as given. And to some extent, along with that, the conditions for the reproduction of labor power, as you were saying, and I agree, pass through not just the state, but also through culture, and also through the divisions of gender and race. These are integral to the reproduction of labor power. And there are surprising moments, and I think this is worth bringing up because it's happening right now to some extent. There has been discussion in the U.S. post-COVID of a kind of reluctance for people to return to some forms of work, especially in restaurant and service industries, some of the forms of work in which the cases and even the deaths from COVID were the highest. The claim comes out and has been echoed by many media sources that people don't want to work anymore. But there is a certain way in which, in a very surprising way, the non-reproduction of labor power manifests itself even when you would least expect it. That's one thing that I think is very important. The second thing, and this is kind of a question to myself and a question to you, I mean, the thing that I come back to in thinking about this notion of the production of subjectivity is a question of to what extent is the idea of the production of subjectivity different from an understanding of ideology, or to what extent is ideology part of the production of subjectivity? And I think this comes up most strongly in, as we're talking about, there is an aspect of Marx's writings around abstract labor, most notably and famously in the Communist Manifesto, but I understand that's a manifesto. It has its own kind of particular poetics and particular use of language. But even in discussions, say in Capital, where he, in the section on the fetishism of commodities, where he mentions the religion of abstract man, where Marx seems to associate abstract labor with a kind of its own ideal and its own kind of idea of a kind of indifference, of a kind of equality, of a kind of universalization. And I think there, of course, that universalization, as you were saying, and I think we agree, carries with it its own kind of domination at the same time. But in pulling out the threads of that universalization and that ideal from the domination, is there an aspect of the production of subjectivity that can only be described to as ideological, in the sense of a kind of after image of production that extols and is tries to separate out the universalization from the domination? And then that raises the question, what does ideology critique look like in terms of the production of subjectivity? Is it a matter of kind of recognizing the domination internal to the idealization? So that's my last sort of point. I see some questions are coming up.
Would you like me to read out the questions, or?
Sure. Yes.
I didn't see them. So.
Okay, I need to put on my glasses to do this here. All right, we have a question from Yari Lansel. Argues that, I think he's quoting Jason's book, who argues that the use of labor capacity in the Grundriss does not perfectly correspond to the use of the category of labor power in the first volume of Capital. Could we maybe see Arbeitsvermögen in the Grundriss as a more prominently philosophical understanding of potentiality compared to the mature version of Arbeitskraft in volume 1? What's Jason's position on this? Can we maybe draw any disjunctive synthesis, as Balibar would put it, between Marx's 1850s use of labor capacity and the 1860s use of labor power? So I guess Arbeitsvermögen is labor capacity, and Arbeitskraft would be labor power. Is that correct? Yeah.
I can just say something about that. although I feel like to say more, I'd have to go back and look and do some rereading. But Yari's point about the disjunctive synthesis is an interesting one, and I want to say something about that because I think Balibar uses that term, at least, or I experienced it most recently in his discussions of the relationship between Foucault and Marx. He argues that, to some extent, sort of borrowing the language from Deleuze and Guattari, that the relation between Foucault and Marx should be at best be seen as a sort of disjunctive synthesis, not an attempt to reduce one to the other, as some people have tried to do, in which Foucault's discussion of disciplinary power is just seen as an addendum to Marx's discussion of labor power, or another version, nor is it to see them as necessarily antithetical, but to see them as necessarily complementary in their points of opposition. And I think that, from what I understand from Yari's question, I think that one, and what's I think suggestive about his question is one could do the same thing with Marx, in the sense of where the relationship between Marx's, say, more philosophical discussions of labor power as potentiality, and Marx's more sort of restricted discussion of labor power are seen as not necessarily opposed in some sort of Althusserian sense of young Marx and old Marx, not necessarily identical, but useful in their points of disjunction. And I do think that the sense, and this is something that comes up a lot in Pierre Macharet's recent book, or not recent book, he's published so many, but his book about the productive subject, where he talks about capital doing its own metaphysics of turning potentiality into actuality. This is also something that comes up in very striking and interesting ways in Paulo Virno's writing about the idea that he sees more at work in contemporary capitalism, the idea that, to some extent, the difference between, the difference between capitalism and all previous modes of production is all previous modes of production have in some way transformed human potentiality, our capacities to learn skills, to communicate, etc., into a specific form of actuality, a specific form of mode of life. But whereas capital differs is that and increasingly so, capital increasingly demands that one's abilities, demands to put to work potentiality as potentiality, right? That one is hired not because of one's set skills. I know how to use this or that machine. I know X, Y, but you are hired. And for those of us in education, this is a part where we're in the odd business of kind of not so much training workers, but in people go through the university to demonstrate their abilities as potentiality, right? You're a good student, you learn things, you show your employer that you will continue to learn new things. You embody, it's a very paradoxical position, but the contemporary worker, as Virno sees it, is put in this odd position to actualize potentiality as potentiality. And so the more you have, specific skills, in some sense, the more you are a liability, which is why older workers are cast out and so on. And I do think there's something to be said for that analysis, although one once again has to recognize the way in which even potentiality is itself gendered and normed, gendered and raced in terms of its norms. If you look at what happens, say, for example, with the hiring of people for care work, whether it be care in homes for the elderly or care for young children, which primarily hire women, and they do so by treating the work of care as in some sense naturalized by gender, right? The idea is we don't need to pay you a lot of money for your ability to care for children or care for the elderly, because as a gendered female subject, we recognize that ability as intrinsic to you. And anytime an ability is intrinsic to you, it is not, it has less value, right? So there is, so I'm not quite agreeing with Virno's sort of capital as putting to work pure potentiality, because I do think potentiality is still actualized across lines of gender and race.
I completely agree on Jason's last point. But let me say hello to Yari, who, among other things, was the brilliant translator of my book on Marx into English, and is himself a brilliant scholar based in London, although he's Italian. I will add a couple of points on the question of labor capacity, Arbeitsvermögen, and labor power, Arbeitskraft. In my reading, the notion of labor capacity in the Grundrisse is not kind of founding concept for Marx. He uses the notion in a kind of loose way. While, for instance, a crucial notion in the Grundrisse is living labor. And it is true that in Capital, living labor tends to wane a bit, at least in its subversive dimension. But if you are looking for a philosophical understanding of potentiality, I don't really think that labor capacity in the Grundrisse can provide such an understanding. It is well known that Marx went back to study Aristotle in the early 1860s. And it is precisely reflecting upon the notion of potentiality in Aristotle that it came to formulate the distinction between labor power and labor. You don't find that distinction in a clear way in the Grundrisse. And we know that Marx's theory of exploitation was entirely predicated upon that distinction. So I think that it continues to be more interesting, as I learned 40 years ago from Tony Negri, to work on the notion of living labor in the Grundrisse, and to try to project that notion onto capital, in order to problematize and mobilize a bit the notion of labor power. There is a second question that is quite interesting. it is a question about the revolutionary subject. I must say, and this has something to do also with Jason's question on ideology, that I'm kind of wary of the notion of consciousness. I try to think of subjectivity going beyond consciousness. There is a wonderful passage of Michel Foucault conversation with Duccio Trombadori in the late 70s, where he says that we really do not need to pay attention to the notion of consciousness. He was thinking, of course, of phenomenology. What we must focus on are tiers, cuts, that bring the subject away from itself, that in a way displace the subject. I think this is a wonderful image because, you know, this is something that can happen, for instance, in a struggle, you know. It can happen in a struggle without the steady kind of temporality that is implied by the reference to consciousness. Having said this, I wouldn't oppose the emergence of the subject in struggles to ethical organization of selves, as you write. I think that both are intertwined, particularly if, in a way, again, with Foucault, we understand the ethical organization of selves in terms of practices. In terms of practices that, of course, are kind of imbricated in the field of ideology. So while I say that I'm a bit wary of the notion of consciousness, I fully acknowledge the relevance of ideology. The relevance of the imaginary dimension, to put it simply, with a reference to Spinoza, first of all. Again, just to give a hint, I use to think of ideology along the lines suggested by Stuart Hall's reflections on Althusser on the one hand and on Gramsci on the other hand. But this is a point, of course, that I would like to discuss more.
There's another question from Gus Burns that kind of extends Yuri Lance's question and deals with how in the early manuscripts do we find another version of labor power capacity when Marx refers to, quote, the powers, or quote, human effectiveness, unquote.
Yeah, I think if I can pick up on that a little bit, you know, one of the interesting things about when Marx writes about species being in the 1844 manuscripts, he writes about it as something which one is alienated from in the labor process, right? The notion being that human beings produce not in a specific limited fashion as animals are thought to do, but produce universally, utilizing sort of all of nature and producing for the totality of humanity. And to some extent, the selling of labor power, the selling of one's life as a means to life is an alienation from that potentiality. What I think is interesting is that, you know, the notion of species potential reappears in Capital in the discussion of cooperation. And it's not as something one is alienated from, it is something that capital itself puts to work, right? This is the notion that Marx has, is that a group of people working together is always going to be more productive than the sum of its parts, right? There's always going to be a surplus there that goes above and beyond simply adding up, if you could, sort of the different workers' productivity. And so rather than see species being, or species capacity, Gattungsvermögen, as he writes about it in Capital, as something one is alienated from, it is something that capital itself puts to work. And I think this is something that I think is increasingly important for talking about contemporary capital, is not thinking in terms of the sort of alienation from the individual, because capitalism as a material practice and as an ideology is quite comfortable with individuals as individuals. What I think is more important is a sort of sense of the alienation or disconnect from our cooperative potentiality, especially in the sense that that cooperative potentiality, this is something that Marx writes about as well, appears as if it comes from capital itself, right? And I think this is one of the things I think is very striking in contemporary capitalism, where we have all these various industries that utilize in one form or another, extract, as Sandro writes about, extract the sort of cooperative knowledge of humanity and present that as if it is an attribute of the capitalist enterprise, and sometimes even the attribute of the sort of capitalists themselves, these sort of fetish figures of your Zuckerbergs and so on, who are seen as the embodiment of collective intelligence that they really extract from society in general. And I think that more than a matter of, I mean, if one wanted to revive, and I'm not sure everyone wants to, the notion of alienation today, I think that it's not about the alienation of the individual that becomes important. It's the alienation of social cooperation that becomes important, and the inability to think of social cooperation in any other form as that which always already belongs to capital.
Well, I was saying at the beginning that I always sense the kind of theoretical and political complicity with Jason reading his work. And today I sensed that also listening to him. I think he made a couple of really important points. Let me say a couple of words on the 1844 manuscripts, where, of course, you have amazing pages on labor, and what I find a really nice definition of labor: life engendering life, if I remember correctly the English translation. At the same time, in the 1844 manuscripts, Marx was convinced that under capitalism, labor itself is transformed into a commodity. You had labor. As we know, in the Grundrisse and in Capital, Marx's understanding of labor became much more sophisticated. There were several binaries: abstract labor, concrete labor, labor power, labor, dead labor, living labor, past labor, present labor. But it is true that there are some notions developed by Marx in 1844 that come back in the Grundrisse and in Capital, although in a transformed form. Jason was referring to chapter 13 of Capital, which means the analysis of cooperation, which I also find a very important chapter nowadays. In that chapter, Marx writes that cooperation develops the capabilities of the species. And in a way, is going back to the notion of species being in the 1844 manuscripts. And also on the question of alienation, I completely agree with Jason. Independently of the fact that we decide to use the notion or not to use the notion, the real point is the disconnection from our cooperative potentiality. Just think of people working for delivery companies, people that are managed by algorithms. I mean, in every city, not only in the West, you see a lot of people on their bike that are going to deliver food. And they are totally focused on their smartphone and on the guide of the algorithm. They are completely isolated. They are figures of an absolutely individualized labor. But at the same time, that labor could not be possible without a sophisticated web of cooperation that involves hundreds, thousands of other workers. I think this is a very effective image of the disconnection of a worker from his or her cooperative potentiality. I would like to say something also on the question regarding prohibition. You know, independently of how we understand prohibition, there is a negative element that is constitutive of production of subjectivity under capital. I prefer to think of it in terms of a kind of cut, a kind of radical limit precisely to the development of the capabilities of the species, to go back to the phrase used by Marx in his analysis of cooperation in Capital. But to speak of the double sense of the genitive in the phrase production of subjectivity, as Jason does, allows us to grasp both sides of production of subjectivity, which means power on the one hand, to put it quickly, but also limits. And I guess prohibition is part of limits.
Here's a question about subjectivation. Classical political economy assumes there's no need for it. Man just has a natural propensity to truck and barter, as Adam Smith says. So that explains factories and all the elements of capitalism. And the primitive accumulation story is to explain how people are remade for capitalism, or at least workers. There's a lot of text that addresses that. But doesn't the conquistador have to be made into a capitalist? In other words, how is the subjectivation not of the worker, but of the master or the capitalist? How does that take place? I think in many leftist accounts, it's just assumed that one is born a capitalist and one goes out and then remakes workers. How does Marx deal with that question, and how would you articulate that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I think it is, and here's someone I don't often cite, but there's a provocation by Alain Badiou where he says, you know, at one point, this is back when he wrote Theory of the Subject, we must think imperialism not just as substance, but as subject, you know, twisting the old Hegel line. And I think that there's a certain sense in which I definitely would argue that Marx is more interested in the production of subjectivity of the worker, more into the way in which human beings have to be made into sellers of labor power. That is a more interesting question than the production of subjectivity of the capitalist. Although I do think there are several lines in Marx, or several points of inquiry, which can think about the production of subjectivity of the capitalist. And I think they're two, and they're somewhat contradictory. There is the extent to which, and I think you know, Marx's emphasis is on capital as a primarily impersonal form of domination. This is what differentiates it from feudalism and everything that came before. And that impersonality takes on its own strange nature, right? There's that passage in the chapter on the working day where Marx takes up the voice of the worker and says, you know, you may have a kind heart, you may be a member of the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals and so on, but what confronts me is not, you know, there's no heart beating in it. And the extent to which there's a separation between the subjectivity of the capitalist and what the capitalist does, right? I mean, this is integral to capital. This is why, to some extent, you know, one never gets to confront a real master. If you talk to a boss who just reduced wages or laid off workers, their answer would be, you know, it's not me. I'm responding to the dictates of the market, to competition, and so on. There's no point where you get to confront anyone who would ever be in charge of the system. So there's a production of a certain kind of division between subjective intention and actual functioning. That's one, I think, analysis of the capitalist. The capitalist is, in that way, not just a bearer, you know, that famous Trager Marx uses, bearer of economic relations as a kind of methodological postulate, but the capitalist is a bearer of economic relations. What they think and how they feel about things is pretty much indifferent to how they function in relation to capital. But there's another aspect, and since we've been talking a lot about primitive accumulation, there's also the sense in which I think one of the things that Marx is trying to talk about in primitive accumulation is the way in which the story that capital tells about itself, of the sort of indolent and lazy workers who, spent all their productivity, and the proto-capitalist who saved and scrimped, is a kind of moralizing tale about capital itself, that the people who have capital have capital because they in some sense are smarter, morally good, etc. And these two versions are in total contradiction with one another, right? The one is the idea that capital is morally indifferent, doesn't care about morality. Morality is a sideshow for the real function of the economy. And the second version is a one in which capital sort of coats itself with a moral veneer. And I think that contradiction in Marx could be a vacillation of his different point of view. But I also think that if it is a vacillation of Marx's point of view, it's a vacillation which seems oddly suited to talk about capitalism today, which constantly plays off both cards. Sometimes capital says, hey, this is not about morality. And sometimes it invokes morality, but often invokes morality in a very one-sided way. Take the current example, what's happening right now in the US with the supposed labor shortage. I mean, we see a lot of newspapers asking this question, why don't people want to go to work? Framing this question as a moral question. Is it laziness, right? They're not framing it as an economic question, which is maybe workers have decided that wages are too low given what they have to give up of their existence as they've seen in COVID, right? They're framing it as a moral question. Why don't people want to go to work? We never see, during times of high unemployment, we never see a moral question phrased, why don't capitalists want to hire people, right? Morality is disproportionately applied and selectively applied across the division between capitalists and workers and across the other economic divisions as well. So I think if Marx has a theory of a capitalist, it is the contradictory unity of the absolute indifference to subjectivity and morality, and at the same time, the veneer of a kind of subjectification of the benevolent capitalist as a kind of social role or norm.
Yes, I add something on the point of the capitalist subjectivity in Marx, and particularly in Capital. Marx employs at the beginning of Capital, in particular in chapter 2, a very intriguing notion, the notion of Charaktermaske in German, which is usually translated as mask in English, but Charaktermaske is something more than a mask. It is a kind of reference to the world of theater. Charaktermaske is the mask that the actor wears before going on stage to embody a character. There would be much more to say about this notion and about the resonances of this notion. But what is important now is that the notion of Charaktermaske refers primarily to the capitalist. The capitalist is a mask, and behind the mask, there is the pressure of kind of objective relations, objective forces that drive the capitalist. It seems to me that this is a quite interesting point. Jason gave a couple of examples of how we can refer this theory to concrete examples. But then these forces, these objective forces, are further specified by Marx when he talks about the tendency to an unlimited valorization and accumulation as goal of the capitalist. So Marx says, you know, what interests the capitalist is not a specific good, the accumulation of specific goods that he wants to use. No, it is the movement of value. You know, what comes to my mind is a famous image that you can find in the Elements of Law, Natural and Civil by Thomas Hobbes, where he says that the human condition is similar to a kind of running, to an athletic competition that never ends, in which nobody wins. The only thing that matters is to be at the front, you know. And the end of the running is death, right? Hobbes. I think Marx had this kind of image in mind when he wrote about the limitless movement of valorization of capital as kind of ghostly subjectivity of the capital. There is a quite long question on Marx's conception of the individual subject. To be honest, I don't think that Marx had a conception of the individual similar to the liberal understanding of the individual. Yes, of course, Marx was a kind of astute reader of classical liberal thinkers, not only Adam Smith, David Ricardo, but also John Locke. We were talking about labor power. You know, labor power is in a way constructed upon Locke's idea of the property of the self. Of course, Marx was also kind of rethinking that idea, but it was important for him. But nevertheless, if you think, for instance, at the question of the atomization of individuals that you mentioned in the question, well, Marx was very critical of the idea of atomization as a kind of analytical tool for the bourgeois Gesellschaft, society. Sorry. He criticized the idea of the image of atomized individuals in the poverty of philosophy, for example, but also in the German ideology. And he has a kind of understanding of the subject in those works that is much closer to contemporary debates on the trans individual, and Jason could talk more about that. For instance, Marx says that the individual can individuate himself only in society, you know. And that's quite a different way to think of the individual than the one that is prevailing in the liberal tradition. And regarding communism, you know, to be honest, I never took too seriously the few descriptions of communism that you can find in Marx's work, because they are just, you know, images, references to something to be developed in practice. But also such a basic definition of communism as the one that you mentioned, free association as living conditions of deliberated, unfettered individuals. Well, why not? Why not? If we elaborate a bit on that, I think it can be, it can provide the basis for a communist imagination, you know, because, you know, we have to talk about a communist imagination. We don't want to write recipes for the restaurant of the future, as Marx writes in the preface to Capital.
But there is the second part of the question says, does Marx's account of the free association of individuals need to be overcome by more physically and socially constrained versions of the individuality a la the trans individual? Sounds like a question that Jason should address.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Marx does have this notion, is something that, once again, Virno picks up on, this notion of the social individual. I do think that Marx, in the sense that, as Sandro was saying, that one only develops one's individual capacities in relation with others in society, can only individuate oneself, as Marx says when he cites Aristotle in the 1857 introduction, in society. I also would think that, and this is, I'm going to get at this question kind of obliquely, I also think that I think we have to be careful and not take at face value the equation of sort of bourgeois society or capitalist society as an individualistic society. I think it's accurate to refer to it as an atomistic society, one predicated on separation. But I think that there's a certain sense in which individuation in capitalist society has its own coercion into a kind of similarity and sameness, right? I mean, to the extent that, say, for example, we are all in capitalism motivated to try and sell our labor power in order to get the most possible money for our labor power, that imposes a kind of uniformity of conduct, right? You can see this uniformity everywhere around you. If you to take the example of a place where I work at a university, you have students who are constantly worried in terms of what can they do in order to gain employment when they graduate? What should they major in? What should they study? What should they do? And you see how that compulsion produces not individuality in any sort of meaningful sense of people acting as unique and expressions of their own capacities and powers, but you see it imposing a kind of uniformity. Everyone becomes a business major. Everyone wants to do and think the same things so that they can sell their labor power. And to a certain extent, one could see this not only in the sale of labor power. This is something I think is interesting and comes up in the work of Bernard Stiegler. Bernard Stiegler thinks on one level that Marx's notion that he does seem to suggest that in the sphere, the hidden abode of production, we are social, and in the sphere of consumption, we are individual. That was, written in 1867. That was written before the immersion, the invention of contemporary consumer society and the massive powers of advertising and so on, that Stigler isn't even sure that we see individuals in the sphere of exchange anymore, given the compulsion to buy the same things, consume the same ways, and so on. So I think that in part of this discussion, I would just stress that that a capitalist society is a society, I think, of atomation and separation. And as Sandro is pointing up in his example of a delivery rider, it's increasingly so, right? One of the interesting things about contemporary production versus earlier forms of production is that if you went into a factory or even went into an office building, you were at least on some level aware of the presence of other people working under similar conditions and the connection of your labor to theirs. When you are looking at a phone that is powered by an algorithm, you don't even see the extent to which you are engaged in a collective process. It is an increasingly atomized process. But I don't think atomization, or we could, to use the terms, we could refer to this as an individualization versus individuation. I don't think that's the same as what we mean as an individual in any sort of desirable normative sense. I think it actually may be the antithesis of it. It is people in isolation and separation doing the exact same thing.
It looks like there are a couple of more, or at least one more question. Maybe we should take that and then wrap it up. So I guess I'll read it out loud here. Sandro, you talked about a homogeneity of the working class, unquote, as presented in Marx up to chapter 3, or maybe volume 3 of Capital. If that's the case, is this homogeneity an analytical dimension of Marx's account, or do you believe Marx saw the working class as materially homogeneous? Is this sense of a homogeneous working class generated from Marx, or is it more a creation of socialist theorists of the workers' movements of the late 19th and early 20th century? Thinking here of endnotes on the claim that in order for political parties and labor movements to subjectivate a politicized proletariat, they had to first create the image of that homogeneous working class.
Thank you very much for the question. You may know that the table of contents of the English version of Capital Volume 1 is different from the German original one, and also from the Italian, the French, the Spanish. So sometimes I can get confused by that difference. My reference was, on the one hand, to the manifesto, on the other hand, to the 15th chapter of Capital Volume 1, which means the chapter on machinery and large-scale industry. In that chapter, Marx emphasizes very much the process of homogenization and equalization of the composition of the working class, brought about by the introduction of automatic machines onto the process of production. So Marx was, according to me, of course, convinced that the working class had eventually become materially homogeneous. Think of what Marx writes in that chapter about women and children. He says that the mechanization of the process of production had created the conditions for the employment of an over-simplified labor force. The fact that children and women were weaker than men was a problem in manufacture, did not matter anymore in large-scale industry. Then what you write referring to end notes is of course important. Political parties and unions between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century kind of emphasized the homogeneity of the working class. And in doing that, as we know very well, they kind of produced and reproduced forms of exclusion from the image, the representation of the working class, of a whole set of proletarian subjects, starting with women. I must say that I admire Marx's analysis of the composition of the working class in chapter 15 of Capital. But at the same time, I am fully aware of the problems raised by that analysis, and in a way exasperated, as you write, by political parties and unions of the labor movement. Moreover, in a way, Marx was describing large-scale industry, thinking that it was, it had become the standard of production under capitalism, while we know, of course, that production took many different forms in the following decades. I will conclude by saying that my provisional way to think of the question of class in Marx is to take Marx's analysis of the working class in large-scale industry as only one of the models he developed and used to think of class. Of course, I'm inspired by what Etienne Balibar wrote several years ago about the differences, tensions between proletariat and working class. So if we take the working class as a kind of industrial model to think of class, then we have the proletariat. And the notion of proletariat was in particular used by Marx looking at the revolutionary history of France. So when Marx talk about the proletariat in the writings on the 48 revolution or on the commune, it does not refer directly to the factory. It refers more to the street, to the city, let's say, with David Harvey. And here we have a second model. But then we can also develop a third model working with fragments of writings by the late Marx, a model that we can call the Russian model, where the question of the common is prominent, where we are confronted with what we can call with Gramsci, and above all, with the historians of the subaltern studies, subaltern. I just sketched these three models. And I want to add that for me, the point is not to choose one of them, to make a decision. It is rather to work within the field of tensions that is outlined by these three models. And in doing that, I think that we can take from Marx a kind of important, helpful, effective suggestion for the unending task of, let's say, with the language of workerism, the militant investigation of the composition of the working class.
Jason, do you have any comments on that?
Just to kind of one sort of provocation to kind of follow up on that question, and maybe to give people something to think about. I think the task, it seems to me, is to try and think of a politics that would not need a unified image of the working class. I mean, I think this is to some extent what's at stake in a notion of multitude or a notion of common. It is a way to think revolution without trying to, and of course, these images were useful strategically, but we're living at the point where the multiple forms of labor and the multiple forms of exploitation of labor have made it so any one image of the working class would be as much of a hindrance to any kind of organization as it would a tool, and to think the sort of to think through a kind of militant investigation, the multiplicity of the different forms of exploitation in contemporary capitalism. So that's my closing remark.
I think that's a good point to end on, and it makes a great deal of sense. So thank you very much, Jason and Sandro, for this conversation. I do want to point out that Sandro is also part of a monthly program called Social Movements Lab, which Red May is co-producer on, and usually it takes place about the middle of the month. Have we got a topic for that next month, Sandro, or that's still being?
Oh, yes, we have a topic and we have
a date. Oh, what's the date then?
Let me check, because I don't want the date is Tuesday, June 15, and the topic will be union struggles and social movements in Russia.
Oh, fascinating. Well, I look forward to that. And I would also encourage everybody watching this program to look forward tonight to How to Weaponize or Diffuse a Constitution at 6 p.m. with Aziz Rana, Camila Vergara, Richard Kreitner. This is a moment to really think about what a constitution does, and to escape from the constitution veneration, which is the subject of Aziz's book, of how it suddenly became this beloved document, which is no other country in the world has a similar relation to its constitution, and to see how that is being weaponized as a way of stopping all change. Until tonight, we say goodbye and urge you to go to our website and give some money if you can. We'll see you down the road at other events. Thanks again, Jason and Sandro.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is
Are we off the air? Okay, yeah.